Nan Madol, the mysterious lost city built on the ocean. If you enjoy the content, please consider subscribing and liking the video. It truly helps the channel grow and continue to create contents like this. Let's go somewhere most people have never even heard of, let alone seriously thought about. Picture this. You're in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, thousands of miles from anywhere most people would call civilization. The air is thick, humid, salty. Dense jungle presses in from all sides. And then, rising straight out of shallow coastal water, you see it. Massive stone walls, rectangular enclosures, canals-like streets, all built on artificial islands. No mortar, no cement, just gigantic basalt columns stacked like giant logs. This place has a name that sounds almost mythical on its own: Nan Madol. Nan Madol sits off the island of Pohnpei in what's now Micronesia, and the first reaction almost everyone has when they see it, either in photos or in person, is the same. How is this here? Not just why, not just when, but how. Because this isn't a little village ruin. This is a full ceremonial city, built on more than 90 artificial islets, all connected by canals. People sometimes call it the Venice of the Pacific, but honestly, that comparison doesn't even do it justice. The stones themselves are the first thing that really mess with your head. These are basalt columns, some weighing several tons each. They're stacked horizontally and vertically in interlocking patterns, forming walls that are still standing centuries later, despite storms, saltwater, and jungle growth. There's no evidence of metal tools, no wheeled transport, no draft animals, no written language explaining how it was done. And yet, there it is. So let's start with what we think we know. Nan Madol was the ceremonial and political center of the Sorcerers dynasty, which ruled Pohnpei for several centuries, roughly from around the 12th century onward. This was a centralized system of power, imposed over local clans. The rulers didn't live inland. They ruled from this stone city built on the water, separate, elevated, and symbolically removed from ordinary life. And that separation matters. Nan Madol wasn't a residential city in the way we usually think about cities. It wasn't full of markets and neighborhoods. It was sacred, administrative, ritualistic, a place of authority, ceremony, and control. The living mostly stayed elsewhere. This place was for the elite, the priests, the dead. Already, that tells you something important. Nobody builds something this difficult unless power, belief, and identity are wrapped tightly together. But here's where the mystery starts to deepen. Local oral traditions say Nan Madol was built by twin sorcerers, not engineers, not kings, sorcerers. The stories describe them flying massive stones through the air using magic, placing them perfectly into position. Now, obviously, modern minds hear that and say, okay, metaphor, myth, symbolism. But the reason those stories exist is because even to the people who inherited this place culturally, the construction seemed impossible. And that's a pattern you see all over the world. When later generations can't explain how something was built, they reach for something bigger than themselves: gods, giants, magic. Because the alternative, that humans like them once possessed organizational and engineering abilities that were later lost, is somehow harder to accept. So let's talk about logistics. The basalt used at Nan Madol doesn't naturally occur right there. The quarries are miles away, across rough terrain and water. These stones weren't small. Some are estimated at several tons. And remember, this is an island society. Canoes, yes, but moving stones of that size across water, then lifting and stacking them precisely over and over again across 90-plus islets, that's not casual labor. That's coordinated, long-term, highly organized effort. This wasn't done by a few inspired individuals. This required leadership, planning, food surplus, and social control. Someone was able to command people to do this work for years, maybe generations. And that brings us back to the Sorcerers rulers. According to tradition, their rule became increasingly oppressive over time. Heavy tribute, strict control, ritualized power. Nan Madol, in that sense, may not just be a marvel, it may be a monument to authoritarian control, a place designed to awe, intimidate, and reinforce hierarchy. Imagine approaching this stone city by canoe, surrounded by walls rising straight out of the water. No beaches, no easy access, just stone and silence. It would feel otherworldly. Now here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. Nan Madol is built on a reef. That means whoever designed it understood tides, currents, and water behavior extremely well. The canals aren't random, they're functional. Water flows through them in a way that prevents stagnation, reduces erosion, and allows navigation. That's environmental engineering, subtle but sophisticated. And yet, when Europeans first encountered Nan Madol, they couldn't make sense of it. It didn't fit into their idea of what island societies were capable of. So for a long time, it was dismissed, downplayed, or wrapped in pseudo-mystical speculation. Lost continent theories, Atlantis comparisons, ancient visitors from elsewhere. All of that stuff got layered on top. But here's the thing. You don't need lost continents or outsiders to explain Nan Madol. What you need is to accept that complex societies can arise in places we underestimate, and that they can collapse just as completely. Because Nan Madol was abandoned. By the time Europeans arrived, it was already a ruin, slowly being reclaimed by the jungle and the sea. The Sorcerers dynasty had fallen, replaced by a new system of chiefs. The ceremonial center lost its meaning. Maintaining it no longer made sense, and without constant upkeep, a place like this doesn't just fade, it actively dissolves. Salt water eats away at stone, plants force their way into cracks, storms rearrange the coastline. Within a few generations, the knowledge of how to build and maintain Nan Madol could have disappeared entirely. That's the part that should really make you pause. This wasn't ancient history in the way Egypt or Mesopotamia feels ancient. This was still relatively recent in human terms. And yet the techniques, the social systems, the engineering logic, all gone. Which leads to an uncomfortable realization. We tend to think technological progress is permanent, that once knowledge exists, it stays somewhere. History doesn't work that way. Knowledge survives only if societies actively maintain it. Nan Madol might be one of the clearest examples of that. In the next part, I want to dig deeper into what Nan Madol represents, not just as a construction mystery, but as a psychological and cultural one. Why build a city on water? Why isolate power this way? And why does this place, even now, feel unsettling to people who visit it? Because Nan Madol isn't just impressive, it's eerie, and there's a reason for that. So let's lean into that feeling for a second, because almost everyone who talks about Nan Madol uses the same word eventually. Unsettling. Not scary in a jump scare way. Not dramatic. Just heavy, quiet. Like the place is holding on to something it doesn't want to explain. When people visit Nan Madol today, they don't describe it as inspiring or uplifting. They describe it as oppressive. The walls feel too tall. The spaces feel too narrow. The canals are calm, but not inviting. Sound behaves differently there. The jungle closes in. And even if you don't believe in anything supernatural, you can't shake the sense that this place wasn't meant for ordinary life. That's not an accident. Nan Madol was built to separate power from people, to physically manifest hierarchy. The rulers didn't sit on thrones in open plazas. They withdrew behind stone walls, across water, into spaces that required deliberate effort just to approach. Access itself was a form of control. And that tells us something important about how the Sorcerers dynasty understood authority. Power wasn't supposed to be familiar. It was supposed to feel distant, overwhelming, and inevitable. You didn't walk into Nan Madol casually. You entered it knowing you were small. This is where architecture becomes psychology. Every civilization does this in its own way. Cathedrals use height. Palaces use scale. Fortresses use isolation. Nan Madol used water, a liminal space, not land, not sea, a threshold. You had to cross something unstable to reach something solid. That alone changes how people think and behave. And then there's the spiritual dimension. Nan Madol wasn't just a political center. It was a place for rituals, burials, and interactions with the unseen. Certain islets were reserved for specific functions. Priests, preparation of offerings, tombs. The most sacred areas were the most restricted, and that layering of access reinforces the idea that knowledge itself was controlled, which raises an interesting question. What kind of society produces something like this. This wasn't a loose, egalitarian island culture casually stacking stones. This was a highly stratified system. Someone had the authority to command enormous labor projects. Someone decided who could enter which spaces. Someone controlled food distribution, ritual obligations, and social consequences. And that kind of system doesn't last forever. According to oral history, the Saudeleur rulers eventually became tyrannical, demanding excessive tribute, enforcing rigid rules, losing the support of the people. And then comes the story of their overthrow by an outsider hero figure who defeats the dynasty and restores balance. Whether that story is literal or symbolic doesn't really matter. What matters is that Nan Madol loses its purpose afterward. Power decentralizes, authority moves back inland. The stone city on the water becomes unnecessary, and maybe even taboo. Think about that. A place so powerful, so symbolically charged, that once its system collapses, it can't be reused. It doesn't get repurposed. It gets abandoned. That's rare. Most monumental sites get recycled, stones reused, foundations rebuilt. Nan Madol doesn't. It's left to decay, as if continuing to occupy it would be an act of defiance against the new order. And then the stories change. This is where the myths deepen. Locals speak of spirits inhabiting the ruins, of illness befalling those who disrespect the site, of bad luck following people who take stones from the city. Again, you don't have to take that literally to understand its function. These stories protect the ruins. They discourage interference. They preserve memory when written records don't exist. But here's the part that really sticks with me. Even stripped of myth, Nan Madol shouldn't exist by our modern assumptions. It doesn't fit neatly into the story we tell ourselves about technological development. We expect complexity to emerge in fertile river valleys, with agriculture surpluses and centralized bureaucracies. Nan Madol emerges on a small island in a challenging environment, using materials that are brutally difficult to work with. And yet, it happened, which forces us to confront something uncomfortable. Our models of history are simplified. They're averages. They miss outliers, and Nan Madol is an outlier in the purest sense. A place that developed its own solutions, its own expressions of power, its own monumental language. It wasn't copying anyone else. There's no clear precedent, no obvious influence from distant empires. This was indigenous innovation, born from local conditions and local beliefs. And then it vanished. Not in fire, not in conquest, but in relevance. That might be the most haunting part of all. The stones didn't fall because someone destroyed them. They fell because no one needed them anymore. So when people ask, what is Nan Madol? I think the best answer is this. It's a reminder. A reminder that humans have repeatedly built things that seem impossible in retrospect. A reminder that knowledge can be hyperlocal, incredibly advanced, and still disappear. A reminder that power leaves traces, not just in artifacts, but in how spaces make us feel centuries later. Nan Madol isn't a mystery because we can't date it or identify who built it. It's a mystery because it challenges our expectations. It asks us to rethink what complexity looks like, where it can emerge, and how fragile it really is. And maybe that's why standing among those stones feels so strange. You're not just looking at ruins, you're standing inside a question. One that doesn't demand an answer so much as it demands humility. Because if a society capable of building Nan Madol can rise and fall on a remote Pacific island, leaving behind nothing but stacked stone and whispered stories, then how permanent is anything we're building now? That's the quiet weight of Nan Madol. Not a lost civilization, not an unsolved puzzle, but a warning written in basalt, and it's still standing.